We're in Activity 5.2, building the Automo Blocks T9 windshield. Go ahead and open up a new part file, and this is what you're going to begin building. So open up a new part file. I've done that right here. Make sure you save it. Do the program menu, choose Save or Save As here for the first time, and go ahead and save it and name it. Make sure you know where it is on your computer and save it as the windshield. Okay, we're going to begin with a 2D sketch on a work plane, and I'm under part 1. We're going to use the line and arc tools to create this profile of the windshield. Okay, I'm going to move the origin kind of off to the side, and I'm actually not going to use the origin. Okay, I'm going to begin with the bottom horizontal line. So I click once, I get a horizontal constraint with my line tool. I do not click with my mouse, and then I type in the dimension on my keyboard, 3.040. Make sure you're using your sheet that has all the dimensions of this part. Okay, right click and say OK. Before we can make the next 3 curves, they are all arcs, we need to place 2 points that are work points or reference points for us that these arcs are going to connect to. So I'm going to grab the point tool, and I'm just going to eyeball and kind of approximate where I see those points at. One is above and just a little to the right of that first point, and there's another one that's kind of diagonally up and right from that one. Right click and say OK. Now we're going to dimension these 2 points into space. So the higher point here is 2.550 from the end. And it is 1 inch from that horizontal line, vertically speaking. So I'll dimension that vertical distance to be 1. Okay, so that point has been locked into space. Let's dimension this point now. This point is 3.010 from the right. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it from this point here and edit the dimension, 3.010. And height-wise, over on the left, I can see it's 0.640. Okay, so I've dimensioned those 2 points into space. I want to turn off the dimension tool. I right-click and say OK. Next, we're going to use a 3-point arc. A 3-point arc is going to allow us to pick the 2 endpoints of where the arc will begin and end. Those are my first 2 points. So I'm going to start on the left side. I've got an arc that goes from the left side of the horizontal segment up to this first point, right there. And then I can move it now, and the third point is going to determine what the radius of this arc is. Imagine that the arc is part of a full circle. So the more you pull it away, the smaller the radius. I want to just pull it in the direction that the arc should curve, and then let go of my mouse. I'm not going to click. Now I'm going to type the correct dimension, and on here I can see that this arc, it almost doesn't look like an arc, but you see that it's a radius 6.0. So it's a large radius, and so for that little distance we're seeing such a small part of that circle that it almost doesn't even look round. Okay, now I'm going to use the arc tool again from this point to this point. And again, I want to just go ahead and bow the arc in the correct direction, let go of my mouse, now use the keyboard. The radius on my diagram tells me that radius is 0.4. And lastly, from here down to the right side of this horizontal line, and this also has a radius 6 and it's bowing out or up. So I click there, I get it to bow in the correct direction, and I now use my keyboard to type in the correct radius, 6.0. Right click and say OK. Okay, so we've just done that. I'm on to part 2. Later, we're going to apply a couple fillets, and these arcs, while they're the right size, if we haven't applied and made sure that this is as smooth as it can be in here, we can run into some issues. So the sizes are going to help hold kind of things in place. We're going to go ahead and delete this dimension right here, this 2.550, and this 1.0. So the constraints on this point, the dimensional constraints, we're just going to right click on them and delete. Right click and delete. Okay, now we're going to use our geometric constraint of tangent, and we're going to have these two arcs be tangent to each other, right here and right here. It's going to help smooth that out for our fillet. We don't need to delete the dimension constraints on this point, but we do need to apply the tangent here and here. Right click and say OK to turn off the tangent tool. You're now finished creating that profile. You can say Finish Sketch and Extrude. And on the next page, we can see that the extrusion should be a depth of 2.55. And now you can begin to see this windshield take shape. Go ahead and save again. Just make sure your document continue to save periodically. Okay. Now we're going to apply fillets to the two sides. Choose the fillet tool, or it might say chamfer. You can hit the drop down to toggle between the two. So I'm going to choose this. We want to update the radius first. We're told that the radius should be a 1/2 inch, 0.5. To that side, I'll use my view cube to rotate around to a different isometric view. I click on the different corners on the top to keep the top up and just to rotate around, but to have an isometric. Choose the other side and click the green check mark. And now we've applied our fillets. Next, we're going to rotate to see the underside. So I'm going to click the bottom corner here to get an isometric seeing the underside. And we're going to hollow this out. So we're going to use the shell tool. Click shell. You need to look at your multi-view drawing of the part, and that will help you. There's a couple different places where they do show the thickness of this part as 0.07. So we're going to shell this out. We want a thickness of 0.07, and we're going to choose the underside. So this is the side that we're going to scoop material away from until we've shelled out this piece. Green check, and there you go. So this part has now been shelled out or hollowed out underneath. Okay. Go ahead and save again. Next up, as I'm in, really I guess it's part 5 and number 3, we're going to create the interior wall structures that come out from underneath this, and that's what actually sticks into the wooden block. Okay, we're going to use an offset work plane. If you look at your multi-view drawing, you can see that that extends below the plane that would be defined by this lip, this flat surface here that goes around the bottom. Our walls are going to extend beyond that. So we're going to create a work plane that we can begin drawing on where that ends. So under plane, choose offset from plane. We're going to choose that lip. We're going to pull away a little bit so we know what direction we want to be in, and then I'm going to update the precise distance. Off my multi-view drawing, I can see that that is 0.67 inches. Okay. Now we're going to start a new sketch on that work plane. Make sure that you have this orientated the same as it is on your multi-view drawing. If I rotate here, I can see in my multi-view, at least the way this multi-view is presented, we have this as the front, okay, and then underneath the front view is where we would show the bottom view, the underside. And so we would just want to do a 90-degree turn down to show the underside. So we've got it in the same orientation to make sure we're building things the same. Okay, so we can see that we have what looks to be a rectangle with some rounded corners and these extra little nubs or stubs that are guides that provide some structural support. So I'm going to begin by drawing a rectangle. I don't want to have any constraints. So just click once, pull it away, try to make sure there aren't any constraints that were automatically being applied where the corners are already stuck next to something or on something. And now let's get our dimensions of this rectangle. Okay, the width right now, I can see on the paper, they don't show the actual width, they show they've used a baseline dimensioning, they showed the width from the left side all the way to the right edge here of the underside. Well, Inventor can do the math for you. If you can see that that dimension is 2.22, that width would be too long as it goes all the way to the right side. So we can just say minus and then subtract what distance it is from the right side of this rectangle to the right side of the windshield. And that's the smallest baseline dimension there, 0.68. So you can actually just type in the math there, 2.22 minus 0.68. Inventor will do the math and give you the correct dimension. Okay, oh, instead of hitting tab, I accidentally hit enter, but I do want to go ahead and dimension the height of that rectangle as well. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'll grab those two sides, come over here, or I guess I'll put on the left side like you're drawing. And we've got the same thing. We've got a 2.26 from this edge all the way to down here. And then in Inventor, I can see that from this edge to the bottom here is 0.29. So we'll let Inventor do the math. And we're going to say that this is 2.26 minus the 0.29. Right click and say OK. Now I'm going to just scoot this a little bit so it's closer to being a place where it should be. Move my dimensions out of the way. Okay, and now it is free to move. We've sized it, but it's still free to move and float. We need to now dimension this so that it is constrained in space. So now I'm going to come over here and use that distance that the rectangle was from the right edge, which was 0.68. And I'm going to apply this, 0.68. And also the distance from the bottom of this rectangle to the bottom edge of the windshield was 0.29. Right click and say OK, and now you can try to grab your rectangle and move it, and you can see that it won't move. Also down here in the right corner it says fully constrained. So nothing is able to move at this point. We see that we have rounded corners, so we can apply our fillet. And looking at the detail, I can see that it's a radius of 0.15. So I'll update the radius before I start clicking on and making my fillets. Okay, they've all been applied. Right click and oh, there you go, it's already closed. There's my fillets. And last, I need to make those little rectangles that I see. Okay, there's a detail B that's been exploded to help us understand the dimension of those, and it is a rectangle that looks like it is 0.04 in width, at least in the detail the way they show it. So it protrudes off of that rectangle by 0.04. I'm seeing the 0.09 and taking away the 0.05 thickness of this piece. So that little thing is going to be 0.04, and then off to the side I can see that in parallel to the side it's got a distance of 0.05. Okay, we can go through and make all 6 of these and dimension them, or you can make 2 on one side like on the top and 1 on the right, and then use your mirror tool to create the others. So let's do that. I'm going to use my rectangle tool, and I want to get a coincident constraint just onto this edge. Actually, you know what? Right click and say escape. I think this will be a little easier for you. Let's go ahead and make our lines of symmetry, our kind of our mirror lines, if you will, real quick. Use the point tool. Let's find the midpoints. I'm going to find the midpoint of that side. Just hover over and the green dot will appear when you're on the midpoint, and just click once and you've made a point on the midpoint of that segment. Do that for all 4 sides. There's the midpoint there. Just click on the green dot. Click on the green dot. Click on the green dot. We've created points constrained to the midpoint. Next, I'm going to create lines that go from midpoint to midpoint, going across. right click OK, and now I'm going to make these two lines over here under Show Format, a little drop down where it says Default, that's the default line style. I'm going to drop that down and choose Dashed, and I'm going to make these dashed lines to remember that they are just construction lines, kind of layout lines for me. Okay, so now let's come back and make our rectangle. And I'm going to have a rectangle constrained to this top, and I could see that the distance parallel to this outer wall was supposed to be 0.05, and it was supposed to protrude away from that edge 0.04. Okay, we'll come over here and make one more rectangle, the same dimensions. 0.05 parallel to and 0.04 away from. Okay, and I'm going to purposely kind of stay away from there so I don't create any constraints yet, and we'll move it into place in a second. So away from that side 0.04 and 0.05 along. Okay, let's get those locked into place right now. I'm going to right click, turn that tool off. And actually I wanted the line style to be back on solid. I'm going to fix that. Just highlighting, click, hold, and drag. I'm highlighting those and making them solid. Okay. Okay, I can actually make a midpoint. This is an easy way to do this one. I know there's dimensions on here, but we want this to be right in the middle, so we can make a point on the midpoint of this. Okay, like I did before. Right click and say OK, and then I can use a coincident constraint, and I can constrain this midpoint to this midpoint. That's actually the dimension down here. And that locks that one into place. That's an easy little trick. Right click and say OK. And for the other one, zoom out a little bit, and we're going to dimension these into place. So looking on our sheet, we can see that we've got the one on the right is going to be 0.95 to the right edge of the windshield. And they don't really show close enough how they dimensioned all the in the detail. They do have you know, a line, a middle line. So how about we assume that that 0.95 is to the midpoint of these. So let's go ahead and make the midpoint, choose the point tool and find the midpoint, and we'll use that to dimension. So we'll make the midpoint on both of these. So we have a point to dimension. Right click and say OK, turn that off. All right, now let's use our dimensioning tool. Dimension, we're going to use the midpoint right there to the very right edge of the windshield, and this first one was going to be 0.95. And then the second one also dimensioned to the right side is 1.94. Right click and say OK. All right, so we've made half of them. You could repeat that and make the other ones, or you can use the mirror tool with these lines. So I'm going to choose the mirror tool. Right now I'm going to select this toggles and says I want to select the geometry to be mirrored, and I'd like to take that rectangle as well as this one. I can just click, hold, and drag kind of diagonally from the top left to the bottom right, and I'll select those. And then I want to choose the mirror line next. Once I have all my profiles selected, then I'm going to reflect across the line. I choose the mirror line. I'm going to reflect across that line, hit apply, and if you zoom out a little bit, kind of pan and zoom out, you can see that we've got those same rectangles down here. Okay, and we'll hit done. Now we're going to repeat that process with this one. So choose the mirror tool, select, it's asking for the profile, highlight that profile, choose the mirror line, now it's the vertical one. We're going to reflect across, hit apply, and done. Okay, so we've got all of them made. We can finish sketch and we're ready to extrude this. E for extrude, or click extrude right here. And my sketch has been broken into different regions. I'm going to have to go through and make sure that they are all selected. So let's try to grab these little squares first. I'm not going to worry about the direction just yet. I'm just going to get my profile selected. And then I will come back and deal with what direction and how far I want it to go, etc. So we want those 6 plus the inside. Okay, if I zoom out, I can see that's the full profile. But I want it to go in the other direction, so I can choose the direction right here. And the distance is not a set distance, as this is a curve. So instead of extruding at a set distance, hit this drop down, and we're going to say you can choose to next on this one, and it'll extrude to the next object, the next solid, and it will stop there. That's actually what we want. If for some reason you have another application later, instead of saying to next, you can just say to, and then you actually get to choose the profile or the solid shape that you would like it to extrude to. So if you want it to continue past the next surface, but onto another surface that's further out in space, you can use just the to instead of the to next. For us, we just need the to next. Hit OK, and we are almost done. The very last thing is we're going to hollow this out. We're going to shell tool again, the underside, and this time the shell is 0.05. I'm going to go back to my home, and we're going to change the color to a clear green. Find clear green, and then it looks like that. Oh, and we can turn this work plane off. The work plane you see in the browser, you can right click on it, and visibility is checked. If you uncheck that, that work plane will disappear. Again, hit save, save this part as told to in the diagram, put an underscore, your last name, first initial.